As the Trump administration reconsiders its support of Ukraine, CNN has learned the U.S. has suspended operations and planning for offensive cyber operations against Russia. A senior official telling CNN the suspension is a major blow since planning for such operations takes time and research to carry out, and a pause could leave the U.S. vulnerable to Russian cyber attacks. CNN cybersecurity reporter Sean Lingus helped break this story. Sean, give us the latest.
Well, Brianna, it's actually not unusual to pause operations when you're in a sensitive diplomatic engagement the way the U.S. is right now with Russia. However, what is striking about this is the context in which it's happening and what we've been talking about on the air in terms of other signals from the Trump administration that it is warming to Russia. U.S. and Russia are in constant state of confrontation in cyberspace. Russia has a formidable hacking units that target U.S. critical infrastructure and do have the capability to shut down some U.S. infrastructure and certainly collect high-value intelligence. That's why for the last several years, U.S. Cyber Command, which is the military's, the Pentagon's offensive and defensive unit, has been engaged with Russia to try to both at times deter them from doing this, but also for the U.S. to collect intelligence on Russian assets. So the pause in operations does have a lot of U.S. officials concerned about what could come next. One would assume that they would eventually resume operations. However, we can't really assume anything right now given what we've been talking about in terms of the changing U.S.-Russia relationship. So it remains to be seen just when the U.S. might resume conducting cyber attacks. However, we can be sure that Russia will continue to target U.S. critical infrastructure based on all available evidence. And Cyber Command was an important tool that has been built up to try to both protect U.S. democracy and critical infrastructure. So it's really going to be interesting to see what happens next, Brianna.
Yeah, certainly is. Sean Lingus, thank you so much.
Joining us now to talk more about all of these developments, Josh Rogin, the lead global security analyst for the Washington Post Intelligence. We're also joined by retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton, a CNN military analyst. Thank you both for being with us. Josh, first to you, is this step back from U.S. offensive operations against Russia necessary to conduct negotiations over Ukraine?
Well, Boris, it's clear that the Trump administration is granting a number of concessions to the Russians in advance of the negotiations. None of them are necessary, but their theory of the case is that this will soften up Putin to make a deal. And that's what they're doing. That's the thinking behind it. Now, it would be nice, one would think, if some of the pressure that the Trump administration is applying to Zelensky and his team could also be applied to the Russians, and maybe the Zelensky people could have a couple more incentives too, but that's just not the way the Trump administration is playing it. So right or wrong, this is wrapped up into the Trump administration's broader outreach to Russia. And, that is going to go apace no matter what Zelensky says or doesn't say.
Yeah, so, and Cedric, tell us what this is, like in very real terms, what the U.S. is pausing, how this is used, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine.
Right. So, Brianna, when you look at what the U.S. does in cyber operations, they basically conduct reconnaissance operations of adversary networks. Concretely with Ukraine, they also look at what the Russians are doing against Ukrainian networks. There was a particular Russian activity known as Sandworm that attacked the entire Ukrainian electric grid. The U.S. was responsible for helping the Ukrainians determine what Sandworm was, how it operated, and what kinds of mitigation could be done to prevent those attacks, or at least move those attacks in a less virulent area. So that's the kind of thing that the U.S. does. It's very important not only for our infrastructure, but it's also important for the Ukrainian infrastructure as well as NATO's infrastructure.
And Josh, is this unilateral disarmament when it comes to this kind of stuff? I mean, what's Russia doing here?
Right. It seems as if all the concessions are on the U.S. side and none of the concessions are on the Russian side, which seems like pretty poor negotiating from where we sit. And there's just no doubt that the Russians have responded to all of the Trump administration's concessions and outreach by doubling down on their positions. They haven't given an inch, not with the Ukrainians, not with the Americans, at least not yet. Now, again, this is the Trump administration is prepared to defend that strategy until they get to the result, which is the talks about the Ukraine war. And yeah, it's possible that Russia is just playing a harder nosed game than the Trump administration here, but it's going to play out. And eventually, the Trump administration is determined to get into that room with Vladimir Putin. And then we'll actually see. Then we'll see if all of this activity on the Trump administration's part can get something from the Russians. If it fails, by the way, which I think most people who know the Russians and know Putin thinks it will, then the Trump administration's policy will turn again. So I just think we all have to sort of like, you know, as much as odious as this seems and as counterproductive as this seems, we have to sort of understand that this is a process. And when we get to the end of the process, there's a good chance that Trump will figure out that Putin is not a deal maker, doesn't want to end the war, and then he'll take a new approach to Russia. So the thing to remember about Trump foreign policy is not where it is, it's that it can always change, and it'll change again and then again. And that's why I think that this story of the break between Ukraine and Washington is not over. It can be repaired, it should be repaired. And although the Trump administration is leaning heavily towards Russia right now, that might not be how it turns out in the end, because Putin has a vote and he tends to always do the wrong thing.
Colonel, Europe is counting on the relationship to work out and taking the view that Josh is that somehow this will get ironed out, because you had the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, essentially saying that a peace plan could involve European boots on the ground and planes in the air, but even then, peace in Ukraine depends on U.S. assistance. I wonder if you see it that way. Is it necessary?
Well, I think it's a key factor, and the Europeans are basically looking at this as an enabler, a key enabler for their activities. They don't have the logistics that we have in the U.S. They don't have the intelligence resources that we have. The closest would be the British and then the French, followed by the Germans in terms of their abilities. What they lack is the ability to take intelligence, for example, and disseminate it down to tactical unit levels. The U.S. is pretty good at that. That's the kind of thing that the Europeans need, and they need to refine those kinds of capabilities. They have some of those capabilities, but not all of them. So when it comes to this, the Europeans could do this on their own. They would need to change some of their organizational structures and some of their ways of doing business. If they did that, they could definitely succeed against the Russians, because we've seen how poorly the Russians actually do perform in a military sense, given what we've witnessed in Ukraine.
Colonel Leighton, Josh Rogin, appreciate the perspective. Thank you both for being with us.